Hi, welcome to session one. And in this session, we'll look at development as a complex power-laden process, and therefore, of course, when we talk about power and development, yeah, definitely we indirectly or in some instances refer to gender and equality, of course, or equity. So we can not basically talk about gender and equity without talking about the complexity and power within the development processes. So we look at development as a process, development as complex, but also development or development evaluation as power laden process. Um, so development, of course, as we all know by now, development is dynamic and it's a process of constant change. Um, it's relative and contextual, meaning that uh, the kind of development that is experienced by one part of one area wouldn't necessarily be the same as what is experienced in other areas. So it's also dimensional, and therefore we can look at it from economic, social, political, or psychological perspective. Um, it of course it involves many actors and many stakeholders, and all of those, as we shall see, come with their own power privileges and interests to influence whatever development they would want to see. And of course it's influenced by collaboration uh, and uncontrollable it's influenced by controllable and uncontrollable factors. It could be technology. Think about technology versus culture. All those can influence development processes. So development process can be equated to progress or course of intervention, and there are three meanings when we talk about process, and so therefore we can look at process as having flexible design that change that change uh, following learning and implementation of intervention, and therefore in that case looking at flexible or blueprint. So flexible meaning that of course open frameworks of design that can allow particular alterations. But for blueprint approaches look at those fixed kind of approaches to development. Process can also mean relationship and contextual elements of intervention. The interrelationships between uh, stakeholders, the contextual elements to do with maybe resources or capacities within the intervention. Process can also be looked at as dynamic or unpredictable or idiosyncratic elements, and therefore uncontrollable things by management, but are central to intervention success or failure. So those other contextual factors that are beyond control of management but can influence um, interventions. Think about the risks and assumptions that you always hold to have an impact or to influence an intervention when you're designing them. So all those can influence the process. So and they are part and parcel of the process if we talk about development as a process. Uh, development action can be complex and predictable, or locally viable, variable, or meaning that it can vary from context to context, and it's influenced by different context that management has limited control, such as culture, politics, institutions, policies, costs, and so on. And of course, as we shall see in the subsequent sessions, all these have an influence on whether equity or gender can be represented within our evaluation and monitoring methodologies. And of course, each element of the approaches for understanding development process has its own way of manifestation, and therefore elements of the approaches for understanding development can be action oriented, meaning that they should be they should not only look at theoretical meanings but also actions, and the approaches should also be continuous in terms of information gathering, not just a snapshot of a particular context, because a snapshot would only capture meanings and interpretation for a particular time frame, therefore ignoring other happenings in other timelines. And therefore approaches to understanding development should also, as a process, should also recognize and record multiple experiences. And if we are talking about multiple experiences, and in that case then we would be looking at experiences of different groups, and in that case that's where our equity and gender focused evaluation come in, that we want to look at not only the elites within the interventions but also looking at all stakeholders that are affected equally, including the disabled, marginalized, women, old, young, and so on. And of course also the elements of the approaches for understanding development process should also be should also involve subjectivity of monitors and evaluators in that case. And therefore context becomes a very important issue to consider when it comes to development, because context would influence success or failure, but it will also influence whether and how different stakeholders or groups of people in communities would engage in particular intervention. So there is always the ideal versus reality. So as of course as evaluators or development managers, we plan development, we forecast what would want us what would want to see happening, but of course the context influences the or determines the a particular reality that will sometimes fit within our planned within our plans, or that sometimes is contrary to what we would have actually wished to see. So in that case the context would influence our interventions to produce intended or unintended outcomes. The context would also influence whether we consider whether we should attribute particular changes to our interventions, or contributions in that case, if not attribution, and that's the influence by the context. So again, the ideal versus reality. So you have planned results versus the actual results, and the actual results in this case would be determined through evaluation and monitoring, and to get true pictures. Then would want uh, to put in mind the context, but also put in mind that different actions influence or affect or impact different groups of people differently. So and therefore uh, we would rather have subjective kind of evaluation rather than objective, because the objective results generalize realities rather than getting true meanings of the pictures. So in that case, generalized realities turn out to be uh, unfair and unjust, and therefore uh, not fitting any equal or equity or gender sensitive focused evaluation. So also uh, there are individualized realities that sometimes do would rather be more fair than generalized. So instead of having generalized pictures or generalized realities, it is better that we implement equity focused or gender sensitive evaluation to produce individualized realities, and therefore influencing some kind of equity or social justice. And then you also have, of course, contextual realities that would determine those individualized realities, rather than generalized. So it is very important that we take into consideration context when we're evaluating, and that keeping in mind that that context influences how different results of interventions differently influence particular individuals or groups within our communities. So in that case, we would then look at development as contextual. It's first a process, and then now we're looking at it as contextual. So in other words, as always, what works in one context might not work in another, and therefore that has implication on intervention, replication, or scaling. And so what happens in some areas of Uganda may not work where in some areas of DRC or South Sudan, because of the different contexts. Those are different cultures, for instance. So the different cultures influence the implications of particular intervention, and therefore this necessitates contextual realities, or the context within development perspective require flexible planning and learning. So since development is a process, then that itself implies that it should be a process of flexibility, a process of learning, as experience as change is experienced by different stakeholders. And therefore, evaluators must shift from thinking like pure economists to becoming open-minded evaluators who are open to any changing environments, to be able to get true pictures of development or change that they are trying uh, to 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 study or learn. So in that case, context matters, and context again is complex. So while development is a process itself, uh, and uh, differs depending on different context, those particular aspects make development a complex process, and therefore a complex process that involves unpredictable processes, and those processes are affected by multiple actors and factors within and outside interventions. So those make it difficult to evaluate, but also to determine in terms of whether it's the project that has created particular results or not, and therefore require an open-minded evaluator to know those uh, aspects. The complexity of development can be brought by the unpredictable behaviors of actors and multiple interactions and relationships with, of course, resources. Of course, the resources or inputs within intervention have an influence on how actors would relate or act within development processes, and that itself makes the process a complex one. So that makes us question the predictability or the linear causal effect ways uh, that some evaluators or development managers tend to have fixed, therefore forgetting particular contexts that influence processes, therefore leading to changes or different alternatives of achieving results. So, and therefore, when we talk about complexity, we are looking at we are shifting from the simplicity, the sim the sim the simplest ways of looking at development towards looking at development as a chaotic or complex phenomenon. And of course, since problem development problems themselves are chaotic, therefore the way we also design our interventions to address particular outcomes, the outcomes somehow, the process of achieving outcomes also becomes complex, because there is no way, no one solution to one problem that has different kinds of factors influencing it to happen. So we have the different levels from simple, unknown. Under simple, we know everything, and then we move to complicated, where we know the unknowns, and then move towards complex, where we don't know the unknowns, and therefore that makes it different. I mean, difficult to predict the solutions or alternative ways on addressing particular complex problems. And then even moving beyond towards chaotic, where you have crises that are difficult to tackle. So David Snowden, and David Snowden gives us a framework that looks at different levels of understanding problems, and therefore one is the obvious, which is simple, and in that case, in such problems, you have the relationship between the cause and effect, and that is obvious, and therefore would have simple alternatives to address. Then there is complicated problems, or development processes where we know where the relationship between cause and effect requires analysis and some other form of investigation and or the application of expert knowledge to be able to know to be able to know how particular development outcomes are influenced. So in that case, their evaluators can just apply their expertise to know whatever is happening. On the other hand, the complex development processes and problems, in such cases the relationship between the cause and effect can only be perceived in hindsight. In other words, it's not such relationships are not very well known and therefore require some level of engagement or evaluation to understand the causes and effects and so on. And then you have chaotic, where the relationship between cause and effect are systematic, and therefore very interrelated and depending on very many variables, and it becomes difficult uh, to to sort such effects and causes to see how they are related. And then you have disasters, or I mean disaster as an example of disorder, where everything happens and then it happens in a moment and you don't know where to begin. In that case, in terms of solving such problems to create change. And if again we use disaster uh, as an example of disorder, then itself creates many problems that would some development managers or actors find difficult to start dealing with them. So Stacy, Ralph also basing on Snowden's framework develops some kind of framework or matrix in trying to understand development problems and how decisions can be made, or how difficult it can be to make decisions towards solving particular problems. And of course, she also talks about these different levels from simple to disorder, but draws our attention to the level of consensus and certainty regarding certain problems. So if certainty is if the level of certainty is low, but is I mean if the different actors, or if one is close or is certain that the cause effect is so and so, then it becomes easier for them to solve them, and that makes the problem very simple. But when the level of certainty starts reducing, then the problem becomes complicated, and therefore becomes difficult for one to understand a particular problem. And of course, the further we go from consensus to understand a particular problem in terms of causes and effects, and even moving far from certainty about what causes a certain problem or how it affects certain aspects, then we are moving towards complex. And then finally, of course, disorder, where we don't know anything regarding what is causing or what is affecting. So Zimmerman, Wesley, and Patton 2006 give us a simplified example of how we what it is that constitutes simple, complicated, and complex. So an example is of simple is baking a cake. So when you're baking a cake, the recipe is essential, and recipes are tested, and to assure easy replication, and therefore everything is known. No particular expertise is required, but experience increases success rate. A good recipe produces nearly the same cake because same recipe. You measure, and you can measure, and you know what to do. And the best recipes give good results every time, because the replication and scaling of whatever is needed to do to bake a cake is known. Okay, so that is different from a complicated solution or problem. For instance, sending a rocket to the moon. Yes, there are rigid protocols or formulas that are needed rather than just essential recipe. Sending one rocket increases the likelihood of that the next will be successful. Therefore, in that case, you have testing and testing. Then you have high levels of expertise and training in variety of fields. Because sending a rocket, yes, you need mathematician, you need geologists, you need technicians, you need all sorts of expertise, compared to if one was baking a bread or cake. Then there is the key elements of each rocket must be identical to succeed. There is a high degree of certainty of outcome, and therefore you can see how different, complicated, and simple uh, things are. So you have also the complex. Uh, Complex, as we said, you're looking at the unknown unknowns. Take an example of raising a child. There is no particular protocol or risk for raising a child. The rigid protocols have a limited application and are counterproductive anyway. Raising one child provides experience, but it does not guarantee that uh, you will be successful in raising another child very well, because there are different contextual factors applying. Uh, in raising a child, expertise helps, but only when balanced with responsiveness to the particular child. So, could be a boy and a girl are different, or there are other genetic or biological traits or health outcomes that can affect the process of raising that particular child. Every child has a unique and must be understood as an individual. So this is what we've been talking about previously concerning complex development as complex, that each development process is unique in its own way, and therefore requires to be understood independently. And again, this applies to our module focus, gender equity and gender and equity focused, so that while we are evaluating, we put into considerations of such differences or distinctions between different contexts. So complex development problems are wicked, if we may say, because their complicatedness and complexity makes things difficult to approach. It makes it difficult to design specific interventions that would, for instance, be replicated to apply in other contexts. And therefore, of course, making problem definition and structuring and decision making rough, and having us to depend on rational, judgmental, and complex decisions because of unsimplified situations. And so you have the level of wickedness, type of problems, and type of definitions or decisions that may be made. So under simple, where we know the unknowns, we can have rational definitions, simple definition of problems, because we know what applies to each. Under complicated, where you have known unknowns, then you have judgmental, where we can do critical assessments and then make decisions in defining problems. And then under complex, where you have the unknown unknowns, it's a complex situation, and we have many definitions and decisions for non-specific problems, because we don't know what outcomes could result. And then you have chaotic, which involves the unknowables. So we cannot be certain in that case, and we cannot have a consensus regarding the definitions. So no applicable decisions at the time of the problem, and therefore require some long-term procedures or protocols to understand bits by bits, to know uh, different aspects of the problem. So complexity is a challenge to evaluation, because if we consider the characteristics of non-linear process, and then we need to look at development processes as emergent. In other words, that as development happens, or as particular interventions are established in certain aspects or contexts, then new patterns keep coming as implementation is taking place, and that itself makes again evaluation, that requires us to have evaluation that is flexible, that again fits in particular contexts. Again, complexity involves uncertainty, and then unpredictable or uncontrollable or unknowable characteristics, and that itself requires evaluators to be cautioned to know such aspects. So in that case, then how can we deal with complexities? As evaluators, we need to. We need to treat development or development interventions as emergent practices, and therefore try to probe, sense, and then we respond. We need to analyze actual situations, then determine the level of complexity, and then identify most suitable evaluation tool or methodologies. Because in some cases, evaluators tend to avoid dealing with complex situations, or even try to make complex situations simple, which is a very grave mistake, because the more we try to make complex situations simple, the more likelihood that we would end up having unintended outcomes, since we did not treat particular situations as complex. So in this case, again, coming back to Stacy's matrix, So you have rational decision making regarding simple problems, and then you have political decision making where you have some high level of, of, of excuse me, if for instance you are far from consensus, and then but I mean close to an certainty, then political decisions that are drastic must be taken, either through coercion or any other mechanism that would make something happen. But where we have where we are where evaluators or stakeholders are far from certain about a particular problem but have consensus about it, then they can just make a judgment and take a decision. Um, but in cases where both, I mean, stakeholders and evaluators are far from consensus and uncertain about problem, then complex decision making applies, where you must have to probe and sense the situation, analyze it, and then you can choose a particular action depending on specific aspects of that complexity. And of course, you have uncertain decision making uh, for the chaotic problems, because you do not know how to approach it immediately. So again, coming back to Snowden's framework, Snowden's framework is useful in identifying the types of decision-making patterns, but also helps in learning processes and intervention strategies. So, in other words, helps in terms of appropriateness for different levels of complexity, and therefore that is why they suggest that for instance obvious or simple problems, where we know the relationship between the cause and effects, then we can sense, categorize, and then respond. Where problems or development processes are complicated, then we can just use the good practices depending on the experience, on how particular successive interventions have happened. For complex, we just need to probe, identify specific contextual aspects, sense how they influence particular interventions, and then respond. And then for chaotic, it much more requires action oriented evaluation, or action oriented research, or um, uh, action development processes. So we need to try out specific interventions to learn what works, what doesn't work, when and for whom, under what circumstances, and then for what purpose. And that itself would give us the equity that we are aiming at. Because in that case we are sensitive to particular aspects of the complex situation of development. So we also need to shift from planning or just acting as mere planners to learners in planning, and therefore becoming flexible rather than being rigid. So in that case, we would be acting toward equity, so avoiding predetermined or rigid results, and therefore trying to be flexible to fit in particular context, or fit or respond to the different needs of different uh, uh, participants or stakeholders within our evaluation criteria. Of course, predetermined results are necessary, but should be treated as change pointers, not final target measures for success, because in that case would be having the other again the dilemma of dealing with reality versus the ideal. Yeah, so so we've looked at development as a process, development as a complex process again, and we've looked at how one could deal with development process as a complex process, and therefore very difficult or but to deal with, but also very important to consider when we are doing evaluation. So the third aspect that we aimed at looking at in this session is looking at development or development evaluation as a power-laden process. And Morton states that to understand different versions of reality and how they are synergetically related to power issues, the researcher, or in this case the evaluator, needs to establish an interactive link with community members, uh, and this involves understanding the historical social context as well as building relationships that acknowledge power differences. Um, uh, and the recognition of the realities are constructed and shaped by different aspects, um, including social, political, cultural, economic, and racial ethnic values that indicate that power and privilege are important determinants of which reality would be privileged in research context or evaluation context. So in this case, as evaluators, we need to put into consideration that within different contexts, there are power relations and privileges that determine what kind of evaluation information, for instance, would be generated and for whom and why. So, in that case, putting into consideration the ideas of privileges and power would then create an ideal evaluation that would look at equitable measures when evaluation is being done. So let's just uh, first look at a few details regarding power. So Gaventa 1980 provides three dimensions of power, looking at dimensions of um, one party having um, power over the other. And then um, Hillenbrand and others, and Miller 2006 also provide for multiple dimensions of power, as we shall look at them in a moment. So Gaventa states that looks at the three dimensions and points out the power between A over B, and then where you also have and another level where you have the powers of B to A. So in dimension one, he looks at prevalence of A because of superior resources, and therefore because they have resources, they have power over B. In dimension two, there is construction of barriers against participation of B through non decision making, and therefore that renders the that renders B powerless. In dimension three, you have party A influencing or shaping ideologies or particular information that B must consume, and therefore power is expressed through ideological or informational sharing or control. In a relationship of B, where B is looked at as powerless, in dimension one, you'll have where A has more resources and superior to B, the defeat of B is due to lack of resources. In dimension two, the defeat of B is due to non-participation, lack of participation due to barriers that have been put forward by A. And in dimension three, you have B susceptible to the myth and ideologies or legitimization because the particular information that would have liberated B are not indeed shared. So in this case, you'll find that evaluators fit in all these kinds of dimensions, but again more attached to the kind of information that evaluators would want to produce or control regarding particular interventions. So you have uh, your dimension here of power of A over B, and then you have powers of B to A. You can look at this if you check Gaventa 1980, you'll see more details to this. Um, Hillenbrand et al. And others, 2015, of course, looks at the structures and institutions that influence unequal power relations, and of course the implications of this has an implication of on gender equality and equity, and they look at the four manifestations of power. And how they interact to influence unequal outcomes of development interventions. And therefore, this is why it is important that we would look at that evaluators would approach development processes as power-laden processes, and therefore, if they do not factor in such aspects of power, then the information they produce or how they produce information would be tainted with unequal relations. Therefore, rendering the powerless groups or marginalized groups within communities irrelevant, and yet most of the interventions would have created change within those groups. So the dimension one is power over, and which is manifested in of course it's the most common, and it's manifested in terms of distribution or control over resources, and uh, privileges that certain people have over others. Take examples of elite groups that own resources and so on. So can control income and labor and assets. Now, you could also look at this from a gender perspective at household level, where, for instance, you have in some households men control everything, even if the women have access to some 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 aspects of the house. Still, men would have control over income, over assets, and other resources, and therefore controlling one's mobility or body and control of agenda of whatever is supposed to happen. And of course, this creates some differences in distribution and values. So, if let's say an intervention on cash transfer was introduced in a community, and then in a conservative community or traditional, where men have more hand in controlling income and decision making at household level, then there is likelihood that you are such an intervention of cash distribution or cash transfer would instead of reducing gender equity, promoting gender equity or promoting gender equality, it would be indeed reinforcing the inequalities. And therefore, evaluators would need to capture that in term if they applied equity focused or gender responsive evaluations to look at these differences. Then the second dimension is power two, which involves the potential of a person or group to act or form or pursue or realize aspiration for their life or society. And this could be in terms of education or capacities or skills or awareness or confidence or exercise of them. And we all know that mostly marginalized groups do not have such privileges to do so. So any intervention that does not affect that is not sensitive to equity or equality would be undermining the influence of such contextual factors. Then the third is power within, which relates to agency in terms of capacity or ability of someone to do something or act. So relates to agency, person or group's identity or sense of worth or self-awareness, self-knowledge and aspiration. This could have be with internal or psychological resources such as, for instance, self-esteem. If, for instance, a particular intervention was able to improve self-esteem, was it at individual or collective or levels? Then there is power with, which is the most preferred in this case if we want to promote equity and gender sensitive interventions, where you have some kind of collective agency, people working together. If they do work together regardless of their gender, then there is high level of gender equity and equality. There are different mechanisms of power over, of course, as the main, since it is the main obstacle to development. We could look at it in more. So there are different mechanisms under which power over is manifested, and Miller and others 2006 give us the different dimensions. These are the mechanisms within the dimension of power over that operate to exclude or privilege some groups. In that case, so we have the visible power, which has to do with making or enforcing rules, where, for instance, coercion, the government says do this and therefore you must do it. Or community leaders say that a particular group of people must do a certain activity, therefore they must do it. That is visible because that kind of power can be seen. There is hidden power, which has to do with agenda setting, where, for instance, when it comes to deciding which priorities are necessary or more important, then such decisions are made by the powerful rather than considering the needs of the general of all other categories of groups. Then there is invisible power, which has to do with shaping meaning or values or what's normal in terms of socialization or information. So, in other words, looking at, for instance, the media can decide uh, to ignore particular aspects of information that relates to particular minorities. Um, so then why consider power in evaluation? So power considerations provide opportunities for the less powerful and privileged um, to share their experiences and perceptions in that case, because then application of equity focused or sensitive, gender sensitive evaluation would allow you to capture those different perspectives or realities based on different experiences of different groups. And of course, also recognizing power differences between evaluators and interventions, because sometimes as evaluators you possess a particular level of power that allows you to determine what kind of information you would use, or what kind of information you would want to get, and therefore power can render you biased regarding particular aspects that you want to evaluate, but also uh, putting in mind that the beneficiaries or the marginalized look at you as from a powerful perspective, as a powerful person, and therefore that influences the level of their sharing of experience. Then power also in evaluation, ignoring power relations can influence the presentation of M&E findings that are only skewed to favor the powerful or privileged, including the evaluators themselves. For instance, if you're doing evaluation we've had agencies that do evaluations that would only capture what the donor or management wants, and then neglecting what the beneficiaries are experiencing. So having considering power in evaluation has a very key role in influencing high level of equity focused and gender sensitive evaluation. Yeah, of course, with power and complexity and other contextual issues, we need to consider realities. So the big question there would be whose values or reality counts. Is it for donors? Is it the reality of managers? Is it the reality of the consultant evaluators? Is it the value of beneficiaries whose reality counts? So it's very important that evaluators put into consideration that, because outsiders can have their own reality. It could be in terms of what they want to run only. It could be reality of community leaders because they are the ones in power at community levels. There is reality of women or other marginalized groups such as the disabled or poor, or the elderly. All those are different realities that must be captured, and if they are to be captured, then evaluation methodologies or protocols must have an equity perspective in their design, and therefore uh, considering those other aspects, that power has an influence on what kind of reality would count in this case. So, in other words, there is power and politics in evaluation, because power influences who does M&E, why M&E should be done, or when it should be done, or for whom it is done. And it also, power also influences resource allocation. If, for instance, there is an evaluation and the project managers or decision makers may decide that you only look at a few number of beneficiaries and you leave other groups because there are no resources to waste in quotes, to waste on other particular groups or other generation of information processes. And then again, power also influences how information is gathered, analyzed, and used. Again, utilization focused evaluation. If information is of no use, then why do it? So politics, we have aspects of politics of evaluation, because within politics, then within evaluation, there is politics of what kind of evaluation criteria should be used, or what evaluation methods, or what is the purpose of evaluation. Politics on values and knowledge counts, whose reality counts in that case. Or politics on who uses the evaluation information, or should have, or who should have access to the evaluation information. Politics of whether information should be generalized or become specific in terms of different groups. All that is politics that is brought by power and other privileges. So you've heard of the aspect, the notion of knowledge is power. Yes, indeed, because the more information you possess, the more leverage you have to control ideologies. Again, we've seen in the previous slides that one can have power over the other because of the ideology or information access and control they have. So knowledge production and use, and of course that is M&E, can help in creating particular realities. And of course, as we've asked ourselves, the kind of reality matter for different groups. So knowledge is a crucial element of building and transforming power, but also it's a powerful tool to dominate or oppress particular groups. And so if, for instance, a community leader has more knowledge than they could use it to influence particular actions or decisions, or intervention processes that would happen in that particular community. So how it is generated and used, of course, we're talking about M&E, and therefore a requirement for us to have equity focused or gender sensitive evaluation to cater for those different realities, or help in creating those different realities. So power over is frequently exercised through production and control of knowledge, and therefore leading to what we call knowledge is power. So the frameworks or paradigm influence the interpretation of the word, which is the word view, and therefore influence the definition or analysis of development problems, and what kind of focus an intervention should aim at, and of course who evaluators should focus on or involve in the evaluation process. Should they involve only women or men, or everyone? That's the question to be looked at. And of course, construction of realities influence the interest and participation of stakeholders, because each stakeholder has a different reality, and therefore influences the level of whether they should engage in evaluation or not, or whether they should engage in intervention at all anyway. and therefore that necessitates evaluators to have that sense of willing and to be flexible, to interrogate different versions of realities, to be able to capture a well balanced, just and equitable kind of evaluation that would produce different variations in realities, that would capture contextual aspects, to be able to design informed, evidence-based policies or reforms or interventions, so that everyone can benefit from them based on the different realities. So interrogating issues of power resulting from intersections of positions, gender, economics, disabilities, deafness, and so on, including race and social, sexual orientations and others, because all these categories of intersectionalities have an influence on power and the kind of interpretation or reality that would be created by the different stakeholders. So in that case, then would be interrogated for to would be interrogating the various versions of reality to determine what kind of reality would count in our evaluations. So views, perceptions, meanings, and interpretations of all matter a lot in that case when we're doing evaluation or trying to find out whether development interventions are creating particular changes as we would want them to. Um, because you have, for instance, privileged versus unprivileged or marginalized beneficiaries, whose reality sometimes or meaning or interpretations are not captured because of our generalized methodologies, that just give a general picture rather than specific contexts. So in that case, to be able to address or to create a possibility of inclusive or equitable participation and action, uh, Miller and others again provide a well-structured matrix that would help one to see how they can address issues of power within evaluation processes. So, for instance, under visible power, where which has to do with making and enforcing rules. In examples of those, you have biased interventions, you have decisions that favor elites, you have manifestations of existing laws, but those without laws without representation of marginalized groups. So in that case, to address such or counteract such power, we need to build corrective power through, for instance, lobbying, monitoring evaluation, which is equitable, negotiations or public education, shadow reports or meta-analysis, or collaborations or social networking that would therefore help us to build power with or power within and power to. In the under hidden power, you have examples of leaders who are unrepresentative. Some issues are considered illicit or impractical or are not worth public intervention, and some media neglects or considers some groups issues not important. So in that case, as to evaluate to as evaluators, if we need to address such uh, power imbalances, or to if we need to bring in the equity and gender sensitive, then we can confront or engage and negotiate through organizing communities for common concerns, strengthening organizations and coalitions, uh, having participatory information or knowledge production and dissemination. So think about participatory M&E, and using alternative media sources to report or generate particular information or disseminate it. Of course, we will have in different sessions regarding how we can build this through equitable. Then you have invisible power, which is sometimes, for instance, examples of those could have belief systems such as patriarchal racism that influence how people internalize feelings of powerlessness and anger. For instance, you look at women, the way the stereotypes against women, that women are this, women are weak, women are independent. All those are a belief system that keep women underprivileged. So you have also those dominant ideologies that reinforce particular bias or limit information of questioning, that women, because particular ideologies of, for instance, religion, have made them to think that they are supposed to be subordinate or not so. And again, you have incidents of women blaming themselves for gender-based violence. So in such a case, if you are to implement a gender-based violence intervention, then you might not have enough, you might not have enough intended outcomes because of the influence of power over the beneficiaries that you are trying to help or create change. So in that case, you can evaluators can build individual or collective power through popular education, empowerment, new knowledge or collaboration, political awareness, to have leaders also be aware of whatever is happening. Or you could also use information sharing, which is equitable and participatory in nature. So in that case, we could, if such arrangements can be made through evaluation, then we can create a transformative or equitable focused evaluation. Um, uh, because in that case, the transformative evaluation would ask about which version of reality provides an understanding that can lead to a just or equitable change for everyone. Uh, Transformative or focused evaluation, equity focused or gender sensitive evaluation also would look at the questions of how we would engage multivocal or cross-cultural communities in meaningful dialogue to produce particular results that would help to inform better decision making in creating better interventions again. And of course, we can use transformative approaches that focus on social justice, and therefore, in this case, use of equitable and gender sensitive evaluation, but also planning and implementing evaluation as a learning and empowering process rather than just a process of accountability or a process of just uh, for formal purposes to make findings for the powerful stakeholders. So, bottom line is that development is context based and it is complex, and therefore that must be factored in planning and monitoring and evaluation of such development processes. Um, Different situations lead to contextual learning and may require contextual learning and flexibility, and therefore even within our different M&E approaches and methodologies, and therefore, for instance, necessitating use of, let's say, mixed methods, and of course adopting transformative research or evaluation, and then understanding and promoting development that requires gender sensitive and equity focused approaches. So that marks the end of this, but you have some assignments. You could look at it, and so you read chapter 20 of Monk. um, uh, the chapter looks at uh, how the idealists or the economists of the Millennium Development Goals had their reality created through the Millennium Development Villages that were implemented as experiments in within different developing countries, and therefore the MOOC is trying to draw a picture of how those who have particular power and privileges may influence certain information that is generated, or how development processes can be managed. So you read it, and then ask and then answer just a few questions. After reading it, do you have a new perception about development? Do you think it is necessary to involve beneficiaries in development evaluation, and therefore demonstrate whether knowledge is in this session has changed your thinking about development and evaluation? What were your thoughts before and after engaging the learning materials in this session? And then we can take it from there. So these are some of the reading materials that would help you. Of course, you have them attached to the Moodle, so you can have access to them, and of course others that you can access. Thank you.